Good afternoon, everybody. This is the fifth and last presentation on Greek and Roman mythology, gods, goddesses, heroes, and monsters. And today's focus is on Virgil's Aeneid and Rome. I can guarantee you will enjoy Marianne's presentation a great deal, more than my reaction to the Aeneid when I was an undergraduate. I was dragged kicking and screaming through all 12 books of the Aeneid and also Virgil's Eclogues and Georgics in Latin. It was only when I began to teach the Aeneid years later in small doses did I begin to appreciate the beauty of the Latin and how nuanced Virgil's presentation was. It's a great work of literature that speaks on several levels and on several questions. And they're questions that are now and issues that are in the forefront of some of our minds. And that is, it's not simply a patriotic glorification and justification for Rome's greatness, but it's a canvas to explore human suffering and sacrifice that accompanied Rome's founding. And so the themes in the Aeneid that we will recognize still resonate today. What does it mean to be a refugee? That doesn't, persons who don't have a country or a home. What does it mean for civilians to be caught up in the violence of war? And Aeneas himself is seen to have to make all kinds of sacrifices and endure great suffering to fulfill this mighty mission that he doesn't want to do, yet it's been fated. He must do it, even at a great personal suffering of his own. So, Marianne?
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I guess we'll there we are, get started. Okay, Roman mythology, and I just show you two emblems of Rome, the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. Oh, did it go? Yes, okay, so those of you who sat through the account of creation that the Greeks had will be delighted to know that the Romans had no creation account, so we don't have to worry about that. And in fact, they end up adopting Greek mythology. So in fact, some of our best sources for the Greek stories are in fact Roman writers writing in Latin. They bring their own cultural heritage to these stories, and there is also a certain element in Roman mythology, Roman myths of propaganda that's designed to support the ruler and societal order. So it's a little bit different from the Greek mythology. Okay, so Rome, remember, was a city on the Tiber River, 7 hills, although if you count, there's more than 7, but the Romans said there were 7 hills, so we'll go with 7 hills of Rome, but there were more. And it grew from one city to a vast empire. Everything you see in the fuchsia, I guess, everything that you see was part of the Roman Empire. You notice in Great Britain, they got to a certain point and they just couldn't deal with those barbarians up there, so they just Hadrian built a wall and said, y'all stay over there, we won't worry about it. So this is different from the Greek world, where we had individual city-states that had their own stories, their own mythological founders. This is a mythology that's also encompassing empire in a certain way. There are many early peoples living in Italy who talk about the influences on the Romans. The most important were the Etruscans in the north and the Greeks in the south. Okay, so those were the two dominant groups, and then the Latins in the actual area of Rome. The Etruscans, you may or may not be familiar with. We know them primarily from their tombs, not that they were people who didn't live lives. It just so happens that their cities are mostly buried under modern cities or were destroyed in antiquity. So we get a somewhat skewed view of them in the same way that we have a slightly skewed view of the Egyptians. The Egyptians didn't live in pyramids, right? They didn't always think about the afterlife, but most of our information about the Etruscan comes from tomb art, and this is an example of a tomb painting where you see some things that are going to be influential on the Romans. You see figures wrestling. These are maybe funeral games, and this is something that comes from the Greek world as well. And then you see a figure with a curved stick and some birds. The Etruscans were very interested in reading the will of the gods from things like birds. You'll also see in the bottom, there's this figure that's got a leash with a dog and a tied up man, and the dog is eating the man. There may be some connection between this type of activity and later Roman blood sports, Roman gladiatorial competitions. We tend to think of the gladiators as men in armor who fight against each other, but it was an all-day program when you went to see the games, and the first part of the day was simply the execution of prisoners. Okay, they were just, you sat and watched people get killed, and then later in the day, you got to watch people fight against each other. But the prisoners had no hope. They were condemned prisoners. They were going to die, like this person whose hands are tied behind his back and this animal is eating him. Okay, so the Romans themselves, that area of Rome, the Latins, the Latini, these are where the roots of Roman religion are. And while I talk about the Romans as adopting Greek mythology, their original beliefs were not exactly the same as the Greeks. They did not have human-formed divinities. I mean, that's the thing that makes Greek mythology so special, right? Zeus, Hera, all of these gods and goddesses look like humans, beautiful, tall, fast humans, but they look like humans and they act like humans. Romans initially did not have gods like that. They had spirits that they called the nodders, and they inhabited certain functions, but there were no real stories about them. So for example, one of them was Robagus, who was fungus on grain. Okay, so, what kind of story, there was fungus on grain or there wasn't fungus on grain. There's no exciting Roman story about the time the grain fungus, no. And these spirits were called singular numen or plural numina. So they had all of these spirits, but you did rites, you did rituals to make sure that there was no fungus on the grain, but there were no stories about these spirits. But then they come into contact with the Greeks. And now, of course, this is not ancient art, but it shows you some of what was attractive about the Greek gods and goddesses, right? They acted like people and sometimes like really bad people. They had all kinds of stories associated with them. So the Romans began to make a kind of equation, right? We have a spirit of the sky. Oh, look, Zeus, their god, he's a sky god. So our spirit, Jupiter, is Zeus. And so that's why you have Roman names, Latin names for all of the Greek gods. All of the Greek gods except for one, the god Apollo. Apollo in the Greek world was a god of music and manly beauty and young men competing in athletic events. And these were not areas that the Romans emphasized at first. However, Apollo was also a god of healing. He brought plague by shooting you with his arrows, but he could also heal plague. And so when the Romans suffered a catastrophic plague, they imported Apollo, but they had no Roman equivalent, so Apollo is always still Apollo, both Greek and Latin, whereas all the others have Latin names. And I've tried, since we're talking about the Romans in this segment, to use the Latin names, but I may have slipped up now and then, so we'll see. Okay, so this was enormously attractive to the Romans, the physical form of the gods and goddesses and the wonderful stories that were associated with them. Now, they did have their own gods that performed functions, their own spirits that performed functions that were just not part of the Greek world. Those got human form because of the contact with the Greeks, but they didn't have any stories from the Greek world associated with them. So these are the gods of the family, and then by extension of the state, because it's one giant family, or at least that is certainly what the first Emperor Augustus wanted the Romans to believe about themselves. So you have the lar, or the lares, and they protected the family. Now, who is the most important person in the family? Yeah, well, but to the Romans, who is the most important person in the family? The father, yes, the pater familias. He had his own special spirit that protected him. It was called the genius, not from our idea that he was so smart, but genius from the root of generation, right? He is the thing, he is the reproductive, generative spirit in the household, right? Remember, we talked about this briefly when we talked about Pandora. Women are a container that hold the seed that the man plants. So the man is the impetus for creation in the household. So you want to protect that. And then you have stuff in your household, right? So the Penates will protect your stuff. They are the gods of storage, as it were. And here's a pater familias. Pater familias had absolute authority in his household. What he said went, even if his sons were adults, it didn't matter, and had families of their own, he was still in charge of the family. And he, in fact, also had the right to say who was part of the family. When a child was born, if, for example, let's say everybody in the family had brown hair and brown eyes, and here's this cute little fellow who has red hair and blue eyes, he could say, you're not part of our family, and the child could be exposed. So they theoretically had the right to actually theoretically condemn any member of the family to death if they wanted to. We very rarely hear about this, but there is one story of a Roman general whose son was a subordinate under him, and they went to battle, and the son said, we should attack, and the father said, no, I don't want to attack right now. But the son thought it was a perfect time to attack, so he attacked, and they were successful, and his father had him killed because he disobeyed his father. So anyway, that's a rare story. Most fathers were not putting their families to death, but they could. In the house was a shrine where you worshiped the gods of the household. This one comes from Pompeii. And the central figure that you see draped in the toga, that represents the genius. That represents the paterfamilias. And on either side, those dancing figures are the lares. The snake has something to do with protecting the paterfamilias as well. We're not entirely sure about what the snake means. And then the penates, the figures that would protect the household goods, they would be placed on the shelf of this. But every Roman house would have a shrine, and each meal the father would give an offering to the household spirits at the shrine. Roman society had a number of divisions. The really big division was whether you were freeborn or not freeborn. Freeborn, hereditary, wealthy landholders were called patricians. Freeborn, everybody else, called plebeians. There was also a huge group of enslaved people because the Romans were constantly fighting wars, and anybody you captured, any city, those people would be enslaved. Also, children that you didn't want, you could leave them out, and the slavers would come along and gather them. So, huge population of enslaved people from all over the Roman world. But they did have a provision for some people to get their freedom. There were various mechanisms for that, and people who were able to achieve that were called freed men and women. They could amass great wealth, but were never respected by the patricians. They were never respected by the plebeians. They might be much wealthier than a plebeian, but the plebeian would say, yes, but I was never enslaved. Because being enslaved in the Roman world meant, of course, you had no control over anything, and that was something that was not respected, that you did not have control over what happened to your body. You couldn't, people could beat you, they could do whatever they wanted. So these are the layers of society, and Roman mythology tends to support this view of society, in particular that patricians are great. Patricians are rich and hereditary landholders, and they're not just that, but they're actually better than everybody else. They're just better. They're morally better. They look better. They're just better. Now, early Rome was ruled by kings, which are replaced in 509 by the Republic. And the Republic is something that the form of the Republic should remind you a little bit of our government, because what was the main body that did everything? The Senate. But to be in the Senate, you had to be a patrician. It was not an open election where anybody could run for the Senate. You had to be a patrician. And then after they overthrew the kings, the Romans were so upset about the idea of one man in charge that they had consuls who were elected as two people to rule, and they had very short terms of office, so no one man could get power. And you might say, but didn't they have a Roman Empire? Yes, they did, but this was their idea right after they overthrew the kings. We'll never have a king again. The Senate will be in charge, and we'll have these two officials, and they won't be constantly reelected, so no one man will get power. And the legends that they had, and we'll look at some of the legends they had, justify the rule of the patricians. The patricians are in charge because they should be. It's as simple as that. At one point, one of the Roman senators said, maybe we should make the slaves wear a special outfit so that we can identify them. And another one of the officials said, if they knew how many of them there were compared to us, I don't think it's a good idea. So they didn't do that. Okay. So during this republic, they've overthrown Etruscan kings, they have a republic, they're starting to expand. And expansion leads to a lot of problems for them because they've been a city on the Tiber River, but now they're expanding and expanding. One of the Hellenistic rulers actually dies and leaves his kingdom to Rome. So Rome's expanding either through conquest or through getting something in somebody's will. And the problem is that no longer are the people who are serving with an idea towards public service, but instead these generals who are conquering people right and left are beginning to think about themselves. And the troops that they lead are not so much loyal to Rome as they are to their particular general. Why? Because if your general is successful, you get paid. This is not a standing army that gets paid a lot of money. Instead, you get paid from when he conquers something. And so if you are the troops of somebody who's really good, you're getting a lot of stuff, okay? So this is going to lead to the end of the republic and the establishment of the emperor and the empire, all of this personal ambition taking the place of serving society. You may know Julius Caesar, you may have heard of him, yes. Well, Julius Caesar took advantage of, there was a kind of loophole in the Roman governmental system, and that was, yes, you have the Senate and you have these officials that rotate on top, but they understood that sometimes there's a crisis and you need some continuity, right? Not just the Senate, but you need one person to lead. And so they had an office called dictator, which sounds bad to us, but the Roman dictator was supposed to come, help with the problem, and then go back to whatever he'd been doing before. And this happened a number of times. Caesar, however, successful general, said that he wanted to be dictator for life. And so the Senate said, okay, you can be dictator for life because we're going to kill you, because that just didn't sit well. That was like being a king. So Caesar was assassinated by the Senate. Well, then there are basically a lot happens. And in fact, when I was in graduate school, took a whole course that was just about the Roman Republic, but we can't go into every detail here, right? So what happens? Caesar's gone and there's a power vacuum, and into it steps Mark Antony, and whom you see with Elizabeth Taylor, and whom you see in actual images of the two of them. And then Octavian, who you see on the other side. So it's Octavian versus Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian is a master at publicity, I guess you'd have to say. He had a great public relations team, because Antony's in Egypt with Cleopatra, and so Octavian is in Italy, and he talks about Antony as being, under the sway of this Eastern woman and luxury loving. And Antony was a little bit of a drinker and a carouser and a good time, having a great time. And so Augustus manages to work everything in Rome so that Mark Antony looks really bad. And in fact, Mark Antony doesn't help himself. The god that he thinks of as his god is Dionysus, god of wine, and Octavian's god is Apollo. Right, so you can see a little contrast there. So anyway, Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra. And then we have this issue, right? The Romans got rid of Caesar. They don't want one person in charge. But Octavian wants to be one person in charge. And he's quite masterful in the way that he manages to pull all the reins of power to himself, while at the same time telling the Romans he is simply the first citizen of Rome, and he is restoring the Republic. And the Senate bestows upon him the title Augustus, which basically means revered one, but it's really the Roman term for emperor. They don't actually have the word emperor, but Augustus is now going to be the first Roman emperor, although if you asked him, he would tell you, I'm just the first citizen of Rome. All right, so he worked everything. I'm teaching a graduate course this semester on Augustan Rome, where you would not believe the messaging, the temples, the altars, the sundial. My students were looking at me as if, isn't there any place he didn't try to message something? And I'm like, no, he really worked it. And it's also in literature. He is saying that he's restoring peace to Rome because the civil wars and all of that stuff that happened during the Republic has left the Romans exhausted. And he's saying, I'm bringing you peace as your first citizen, and I am restoring the Republic, although I'm in charge. And he sponsors poets, historians. There's a lot of literature that comes out of this period, and most of it says things that go with his ideas. And his ideas are, he's reestablishing the power of Rome. It's going to be a new golden age for Rome, just like the golden age in Athens. And other things will occur. That is, he's the first citizen, but his family and descendants will continue to rule Rome forever. So he's founding a dynasty. He also has a strong family values platform, although his own family had a few issues. So all of these things are going on. And this is the atmosphere in which the Aeneid is written. Now, it is, as Sheila mentioned, Virgil's genius that within this political framework, he doesn't just craft a story that's rah rah Augustus, go Augustus, yay Augustus, but instead uses Aeneas to explore human nature and human suffering. But the Aeneid is not the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad and the Odyssey were oral poems, long traditions through the centuries. The Aeneid was written. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, and the Aeneid was designed to be a national epic for the Romans. Because if you read your Iliad and Odyssey, there aren't any Romans in the Iliad and the Odyssey, because Rome was not doing anything in the Bronze Age. There's no mention of the Romans, and the Romans want to be connected to this glorious Greek past. So Virgil writes this, and it becomes a national epic for the Romans. And you can see the translation, and then you can see the Latin on the other side. And it's beautiful when it's read in meter. I have no sense of rhythm, so I'm not even going to try, but it is really beautiful when it's read in Latin in meter. Okay, now, Augustus has some connections to Aeneas. Aeneas is not the person who founds Rome. He founds a place called Alba Longa, and his descendants, Romulus and Remus, would later found Rome. But Aeneas is considered the paterfamilias of all of Rome, the great ancestor of all of Rome. And his son, Aeneas' son Iulus, was the connection to Augustus's family. Augustus was adopted by Julius Caesar. The great thing in the Roman world is you can adopt someone at any age. So you can be 60 years old and someone can adopt you, and you are their son. So Augustus was adopted by Caesar, and so he is part of Caesar's family, and Caesar's family claims descent from Aeneas through Aeneas's son. Okay. Aeneas is the son of Venus. Okay. Here's a Greek statue of Venus. Venus, or Aphrodite in the Greek world, the goddess of love, sex, passion. Right? And how does she come to have a son with a mortal man named Anchises? I just show you this. This is just to show you that we have these grand and glorious stories and these gods are great powers, but this is some graffiti from Pompeii. And this expresses this particular person's attitude towards Venus, right? Whoever is in love, let him come. I wish to break the ribs of Venus with sticks and maim the goddess's loins. If she can perforate my tender heart, why can I not break her head with a stick? Okay, so this is a nice, we've probably all been there in love, right? And it didn't work out. So this person is taking it out on Venus. Anyway, well, the gods felt the same way about her because she was always making them fall in love with mortals. And the problem with that is then they'd have children and the children would die, most of them. And they were just really disgusted with this. Only the virgin goddesses are immune to her power. So finally, Jupiter, Zeus to the Greeks, said, all right, we've had enough of this. You're gonna have to pick a mortal man and sleep with him and go through all the suffering that we do when we have children with these mortals. So she's punished for making the gods fall in love all the time by having this mortal man and having a child with him. And it's not a question of, remember, when the gods sleep with somebody, there's going to be a pregnancy. There's no getting around it. So they choose a man named Anchises, who's a prince of Troy. And Anchises is out walking around in the countryside, and this absolutely gorgeous woman comes and says to him, I want you. And Anchises is like, you can't possibly want me. And you must be some goddess, right? And she says, well, I am beautiful, but no, I'm not a goddess. No, I'm not a goddess. No, I'm not a goddess. I'm here for you. I want you. I want to sleep with you. Let us sleep together now. And he can't believe his good fortune. So, he's not one to turn up, a beautiful woman comes to you, says she wants you now. What are you going to say? Well, no. So, of course, they sleep together. And then as soon as they're done, she says, oh, all right, I am Venus. Okay. And I'm going to be pregnant because that's the way this thing works. I'll have the baby and then I'll bring him to you. And, you do what you do with him. You raise him. But if you ever tell anybody about this, that something bad will happen to you. Okay. So Aeneas is born. She dumps him off with his father. He's raised by his mortal father. There is one anecdote that Anchises got drunk one time and, well, he couldn't help himself. He boasted about, like, do you ever sleep with anybody who, well, as a matter of fact, I actually slept with, and he gets blasted by a thunderbolt and gets lame. But, all right, so Aeneas then is the son of a Trojan prince and the goddess Venus. And this is the ancestor of Augustus and Julius Caesar. Now, said this is an epic for the Romans because they're not mentioned in the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's a little bit of something that Virgil could work with. So in the Iliad, Homer has a line, you know that the son of Cronus, Zeus, now hates the household of Priam. Priam, remember, is the king of the Trojans during the time of the Trojan War. Know too that mighty Aeneas is to hold the rule of the Trojans, he and his children's children for generations to come. So Virgil takes that. Okay, so now Aeneas is going to be his hero. There's also a myth that says that Poseidon saves Aeneas and that he heads west. So those two things Virgil pulls together to weave into a story that connects the Romans to the Greek epics, but that also in and of itself is a masterful piece of literature. So it's influenced by the Iliad, it's got the Trojan War story, it's influenced by the Odyssey because it's going to take, Aeneas is going to have to go all over the world just like Odysseus did. But it's not just a matching together of those two things. It's a story that fits the Roman psyche too. Okay. So the story is that Aeneas leaves Troy with 12 ships of Trojans. He and his father Anchises and his son. So remember, who's the most important person in a Roman family? The pater familias. So we've got 3 generations of men. He was married, but she gets lost as they're, what are you going to do, right? So it's the 3 guys. And there are many, many, many adventures. You can see and I can't go through all of his adventures, but he ends up in Carthage in North Africa. And in Carthage, he is taken in by the queen of Carthage, Dido, who is a widow and who has vowed never, she's a widow and there will be no other man in her life than her dead husband. And Aeneas comes sailing up with his ships, and she welcomes him, and he tells her the whole story of the Trojan War. So basically, everything that you know from the Greek side, there's the horse, and they come out and they kill everybody, and Aeneas and his group manage to escape the defeated Troy. But you think about it, they've escaped Troy. Where do they go? Right? They don't have any destination. The Odyssey, Odysseus knows where he wants to go. He wants to go home. But where is home for the Trojans? Home is gone. They can't go back to Troy. So he is, as Sheila pointed out, he's a refugee, and Dido takes him in. And, this is the escape. Yeah, that's his son. He's carrying his father, because remember, his father's lame on account of how you shouldn't kiss and tell, but his dad did. And something else that his father's carrying, you maybe not be able to see in this picture. This is a wall painting from Pompeii. His father's carrying the Penates, the protectors of their home in Troy. So this is going to be a transfer of their home to wherever they're going to find their home. So Dido is a widow sworn to chastity. There's some local guys who would love to marry Dido, but she says no, 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 no. I mean, local princes, not just, guys, but, local princes. She's a queen, but she says, no, I loved my husband. But, well, one day she and Aeneas go out hunting. And there's a rainstorm, and they seek shelter in a cave, and one thing leads to another. And Dido's in love. And Aeneas probably has some feelings for Dido too. So this could be it. he could stay in Carthage and be a refugee there and be with Dido and have love. But the Aeneid is about somebody who's going to be an ancestor of the Roman people. The Roman people don't live in Carthage. Well, eventually they do, but the Roman people, that's not where Rome is. And so Jupiter sends Mercury to explain to Aeneas that this isn't it. This is lovely, but you can't stay here with Dido. And this is where Aeneas exemplifies a virtue that the Romans very much wanted in their leaders and in their men, something called pietas. And we think of it as, that sounds like piety, right? But it's not a religious piety. It's a sense of duty, that you have to put your duties above your personal desires. And so while he might want to stay with Dido, he has a greater destiny, which Mercury reminds him of. Now, he still doesn't know what it is, right? He's still escaping from choice. So this greater destiny is not a thing he can put his hands on, but he's told this is what you have to do. So this is not an ancient painting, but if you look at it closely, Dido is talking to her sister, and Aeneas goes and sneaks off. He doesn't say, goodbye, Dido, a man's got to do what a man's got to do. He just gets out of there. But that's the thought, right? He can't stay, but he's not going to face her to tell her that. Dido is completely despondent and commits suicide, and he sees the smoke from the funeral pyre as he sails away. As she's dying, this is again not an ancient painting, but it's a cool painting anyway. As she's dying, she curses him and all his descendants. And this curse is part of the idea as to why Rome and Carthage are mortal enemies, because historically, Rome and Carthage are mortal enemies. You may have heard about Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who crosses the Alps into Italy with elephants, which was terrifying to the Romans. You ever see in Star Wars, they have those big mammoth things and everybody's kind of used to them. But can you imagine if you'd not really seen an elephant and these people are riding down into your territory? Hannibal almost did it. He almost defeated Rome, but he didn't. But anyway, this story explains the animosity between Carthage and Rome. The Hannibal invasion was so scary and so terrifying, and the wars that they fought against Hannibal, that supposedly for generations, Roman mothers would say things like, if you don't finish your bread, Hannibal is going to come and get you. So this was a terrifying moment for the Romans. All right, so I skipped a lot of his adventures, but basically he's a man of duty. He's a man who gives up what he probably would have liked, right? Who wouldn't want to spend the rest of their days with a beautiful Carthaginian queen, right? Yeah. So, but he's got to do. But what exactly does he have to do? He's got to find a homeland, but how? And so he's told that he needs to go to a place called Cumae, where there is a Sibyl. A Sibyl is a kind of prophetess, and he and the Sibyl need to go to the underworld, where he will consult his father, because in all of this wandering, his father has died. So he needs to go consult Anchises in the underworld, and then he will find out what he's supposed to do. When he gets to the underworld, he actually sees Dido. There's a level of the underworld, and she just turns her back on him and walks away. He sees a guy named Palinurus that he didn't even know was dead. Poor Palinurus was one of his group, one of his oarsmen, and he died and nobody knew it, and they didn't bury him. And he's like, please, please, please bury me. He said, okay, when we get back, we'll do something about that. And he does see his father, Anchises. This trip to the underworld, Odysseus also went to the underworld. Going to the underworld is not something to undertake lightly, because basically you're dying in a sense. You're going to the place of the dead. It's also a very poignant place when Odysseus goes. He hadn't realized that his mother was dead, and he sees her, and Homer, emphasizes that gap between the living and the dead that just really can't be bridged. And it's the same for him. His father's dead. He sees his father, but you can't hold the dead in the underworld. Virgil's underworld is a little bit different from Homer's underworld, and it shows the evolution of views about the underworld. For Homer and the later Greeks, the underworld was a place where you went as a gray shadow, and no matter what you did, you were a gray shadow. If you were the nicest person and you took in widows and orphans and you gave away your fortune, you went to the underworld as a gray shade. If you ran around kicking babies and pulling the ears off of bunnies and just being generally nasty, you went to the underworld as a gray shade. Virgil's underworld is different. It now has an element of judgment. How you lived your life actually is becoming important. Okay? So you either go to a nice place, Elysium, or you go to the deep, dark place, Tartarus, okay? But you get judged. And here's a kind of geography. You have to cross a river. It's a place, it's a place. So here's a kind of a geography of the underworld. So he sees his father, and his father explains to him, you have a real destiny, okay? This is the destiny of Rome, okay? You will impose good conduct on peace, thrust the proud from the throne to forgive the beaten and the humble. You have a great, great destiny. And he shows them all the generations that are going to follow of these great, wonderful Romans. And so finally, Aeneas knows what he's supposed to do. He knows his mission, and he's headed to where he needs to go. He's told that he'll know he's in the right place when the people eat their plates. So they get to Latium, and they're served a meal on flatbread. And his son says, Dad, he's like, this is the place. Yeah. So the Aeneid is purposeful propaganda for a national cause, but there's so many characters in it. And it ends on a kind of unsettling note where Aeneas he gets there and to Latium, and there are already some people there, and there's some problems. He can't just establish what he wants to establish. And so there's a great deal of fighting, and in the end, he comes face to face with an enemy, and he's going to spare the enemy. And so you think this is going to be, but he looks down, and the enemy is wearing a piece of the military equipment of one of Aeneas's dear friends and allies. And when he sees that, all thought of mercy and forgiveness is gone, and he kills him. There's a lot of complicated things going on in this, and a lot of effort has been expended to figure out what was Virgil's attitude towards Augustus. He shows this range of people that will follow, and Augustus is part of this. Rome is going to be this great thing, and yet Virgil he read it to Augustus, and Augustus listened to some parts of it. But when Virgil died, he hadn't finished editing it, and he requested that it be burned after his death. And we don't know if that's because he was just one of those, artists. My work is not perfect. If I haven't perfected it, it must be destroyed. Or if he had changed his mind about Augustus and Augustus's wonderfulness, or did he ever really think Augustus was? It's a very complicated text. It's not that the Iliad and the Odyssey are simple, but it's got many more things woven into it, and people still analyze it. And I think if you want to have more discussions about the Aeneid, you should talk to Sheila, because she taught Latin poetry at UF for a long time. So I put you on the hot seat. Okay, but it is different from the Iliad and the Odyssey in that it's a work of literature that was composed in writing from the very beginning, and that has some purposes to it, although we're not always sure. All right, so Aeneas is in Italy, and he founds a city in Italy. And then his son goes on to found a city called Alba Longa. And there are kings in Alba Longa. There is Numitor, the older brother, and Amulius, the jealous younger brother. I'm an only child, so I don't know about sibling jealousy, but I hear that siblings can be jealous of each other. Numitor has a beautiful daughter named Rhea Silvia, but Amulius doesn't want her to have any kids because that would not be his line, that would be his brother's line. So he makes her a Vestal virgin. Vestal virgins, Vesta, Greek Hestia, is the goddess of the hearth. She's a virgin goddess. She asked Zeus, all I want is to be left alone to sit by the fire. She said, I don't want to, the other gods and goddesses can do all this other stuff. I just want to. And so she tends the hearth fire. And we tend to think of fire as something that's easy to produce, but it wasn't in antiquity. Remember, Prometheus is punished because he gave fire back to man, and man's punishment, in addition to woman, was that fire was no longer freely available, that you had to make fire. And so in every household, they want to keep the fire going because you can't flick a bick, you can't strike a match, right? So that's a very important role, and Vestal virgins tend the sacred fire in Rome. And they are required to be virgin, they are taken as young girls, and then they have to stay virgins until they're about in their 40s, and then they get released. But if during that period you stray from your virginity, you are buried alive. Okay. So, so she's a Vestal virgin. So her uncle thinks, don't have to worry about her. No kids from her. But Mars, the god of war, sees her and wants her and has her. And of course, if a god, she's going to be pregnant. Now, Mars is one of the main gods of the Roman state. As I mentioned before, different from Ares, the Greek god. Ares, the god of war, is the god of all the things that Greeks didn't like about war, the bloodshed, the panic, all the unpleasant stuff. Athena is associated with strategy and planning and those kinds of things. But Mars is completely different. He's the Roman military machine, and he's a dignified. Ares is a bully, Ares is a coward. Mars isn't like that. So even though they equated their war god with the other war god, their conception of war was different from the Greek idea of war. So Mars becomes her lover, and she gives birth to twin boys. Well, she's a Vestal virgin, she can't have twin boys, so they decide to expose them, and they give them to a servant, and they tell him, put them in running water. And why they're very specific, put them in running water so they'll drown. So the servant takes the twins, and he gets to the Tiber, and he looks at it, and he says, water's not running. The Tiber is dry. But they told me, put them in running water. Oh well, I'm just gonna leave them here. And he leaves them in the dry Tiber. So they haven't drowned yet. And along comes a she-wolf who happens to have, cubs of her own, so she's got a lot of milk. And she nurses the babies over the hard part, being exposed, when along comes a shepherd. And he and his wife don't have any children, and look, 2 robust baby boys. So they take them to raise the boys as their own. And the boys are Romulus and Remus. Now, you've probably seen this statue a million times. Well, the wolf part probably is an Etruscan bronze, so it could be, connected to the story. The twins are much later. They're kind of a Renaissance edition, so a little Baroque edition. They're way later then the wolf. They look good together, but if you start to look closely, you see how sort of realistic the twins are and how not realistic the wolf is. So this is a pastiche, but it's never going to be taken separated, right? You see this image on all the t-shirts and things. So this is the she-wolf nursing Romulus and Remus. She didn't eat them. She nursed them. Okay. Well, the boys grow up, and as often happens in Greek and Roman mythology, they somehow know who they are, right? People never recognize people they're supposed to, but they recognize people that they would have no way of knowing. And the boys come back, and everybody, they recognize them, and they're reunited with their mother, and they get rid of their evil uncle and restore the throne. But they say, we don't want this kingdom. We want our own kingdom. And it's like, I saw this in the New Yorker, and mater is Latin for mother, so there they are. All right, so they want their own kingdom. Why not on the banks of the Tiber River, where they were, discovered? This is a great place. All right, now we've talked about sibling rivalry when you've got an older brother and a younger brother. What about twins? Well, whose city is it going to be? Which brother should be king of this city? All right, well, they're going to look at bird signs. And remember, that's a very Etruscan thing, right? They're going to look at bird signs. But then, is it whoever saw the first bird or who saw the most birds? Suffice it to say, they can't agree on this. I love this picture. It's not ancient either, but this artist decided to put the birds in there, right? So they fight. And there's various versions of the one story is that Romulus starts to build a wall, Remus jumps over the wall, Romulus kills him and says that will be what happens to anybody who invades Rome, who breaches the walls of Rome. Anyway, they fight to the death, and it's not going to come as an incredible shock that Romulus wins. The city is named Rome. Could have been Remora, but it's not. So Rome is a city that begins with a fratricide, but this never seems to trouble them. Okay. All right, now, it would be good to have some people if you have a city, but who's going to live there? So they decide they will grant asylum to anybody who's in trouble in their own city. Come to our city. Well, that's great, but the problem is anybody who's in trouble and is free to leave is going to be a man. So they have a city totally of men. And although when we looked at the Greek creation story, apparently that was a wonderful thing for men back in the golden age before Pandora, it doesn't really work. So they need some women. They have a festival. They invite those Sabine women, the women from nearby village and their husbands, and then they kidnap the women. And they say to the women, look, we need women. We'll treat you well. You'll be respectable wives. We're not going to use you as, prostitutes, sex slaves, none of that. We're going to marry you. You're going to be wives. And time passes a little bit before the Sabines can get back there to try to get their women. And at that point, the Sabine women say, hey, these are our husbands. We have kids with them. We're Romans. So everybody kind of holds hands and forgives. Some scholars think, well, maybe there was some kind of exchange of women that actually happened. We don't know. This is a picture of, again, this is not ancient, but the neoclassical painters loved these stories of Greece and Rome, primarily because they got to show naked men and women, I think. But anyway, so this is a Sabine woman saying, stop, Sabines and Romans, do not fight. We are Romans now. We're all one. So then there are some kings of Rome. Romulus is the first king. 4 are Latin or Sabine. The last 3 are Etruscans, the Tarquins. And they have some interesting stories. Okay, this is the story of the 2 Tullias. They are sisters. Why do they both have the same name? Because in the Roman world, a girl's name is the family name given the feminine form. So their family name was Tullius, and a boy might be, for example, Marcus Tullius Cicero, and his brother might have another name, Julius Tullius, whatever. But the daughters, every single one of them is going to be named Tullia. Even if you have 15 daughters, every single one of them is going to be Tullia. Apparently, they usually identified them by first, second, third, or fourth. So you'd grow up being Prima or Secunda, even though your name was Tullia. So anyway, but these Tullias are distinguished in mythology because they are the good and bad Tullias. Servius Tullius becomes king of Rome. Supposedly, his father was one of the Lars, the protective spirits, who took the form coming out of the fire and the ashes, the form of the male sexual organ, and impregnated his mother. So anyway, this is Roman myths aren't quite, the ones that are just Roman don't quite have all the, fun details, I guess. I don't know how to say it. But the two Tullias are married, and bad Tullia, I always do this for the students so they can keep them straight, but evil, bad Tullia has an affair with her brother-in-law. And so her brother-in-law kills his own wife, good Tullia, and kills bad Tullia's husband too. Then they overthrow and murder the father of the Tullias. See, these stories are, pretty basic, right? These Roman stories. But here's the fun part. She runs over her dying father in her chariot. And the street in Rome was forever after named the Street of Shame, because she shouldn't have done that. This, again, not a Roman painting, but I just love this painting, the way she's just going full bore with the chariot. And then we have Lucretia. Lucretia is a virtuous wife. What makes you a virtuous wife? Well, of course, it goes without saying that you don't sleep with anybody but your husband. But the other thing you do is you stay at home and you weave, because you are responsible for making the fabric for the household. You weave. So the son of one of the Etruscan kings has a drinking bet with his buddies as to who has the best wife. And one guy says, I do. And the other guy says, I do. So they say, well, let's go see what the wives are doing. So they go around, and one wife is asleep, and another wife is eating candy, and another wife is out shopping, and nobody's doing what they're supposed to be doing except for Lucretia. Lucretia is at home weaving, and they all say to her husband, you win, you got the best wife. Well, Tarquin comes back, and he says, not only are you the best wife, but I want you. And she says, you can't have me, I'm a virtuous Roman woman. And he says, I will make it seem that you seduced me unless you let you sleep with me. So she sleeps with him. But then she calls all her male relatives together, and she says, this is what happened. And they say, well, that's not, you're totally blameless. And she says, no, I'm not, because I committed adultery, and she kills herself. One of the assembled relatives is a guy named Brutus that everybody thought was stupid, because Brutus actually does mean stupid. But Brutus rises up and says, no, I'm not stupid, and we will overthrow the kings. And so this is how the Etruscan kings are overthrown. So you see, what happened was Aeneas came, and then Romulus and Remus, and then we have these kings, and then we finally get rid of them, and then we have the Republic. But what happens to the Republic? We have Augustus, who then starts the entire period of emperors that goes on and on and on and on. And Augustus was right that he was going to start a dynasty. This is, again, not ancient. This is sort of Rembrandtish painting, but this is what Lucretia supposedly said. My body alone is violated. My mind is unstained. I absolve myself from guilt, but do not release myself from penalty. And she was held up forever after to Roman women as the ideal Roman woman. But of course, we've already seen in this story, she's the only one that was at home weaving. So the point is, this is what women were supposed to do, but this is probably not what women were doing. Remember, I told you Augustus had to exile his own daughter because she was having so many affairs. Did I tell you this story? Oh, well, somebody said to her, Julia, this is Augustus's daughter, Julia, why is it that you have these affairs? We all know you're sleeping around, but all your children look exactly like your husband. And she said, well, that's because I'm always careful not to take on any passengers until the cargo is stored safely on board. Yeah. So anyway, that's what poor Augustus had to deal with. He finally had to exile her. So anyway, that's the Roman story. So all of the things, Apollo and Venus, all the stories you know, many of them we know from Ovid, the Roman writer. So in fact, the Romans had all those. The ones that we looked at today, though, were the ones that are specifically Roman stories that don't have a Greek version, that are Romans explaining themselves, as it were. Why do we do this? Why is our society like that? And then the great national epic, the Aeneid, which stands with the Iliad and the Odyssey as the three major poems of the ancient world. Okay. So as I said, the Republic is established, but then we know that only lasts till Augustus takes over, and then we have emperor after emperor after emperor after emperor. And the Republic is never restored. Although I remember seeing, did anybody see the movie Gladiator? That was pretty late in Roman history, and they were pretending in this movie that they were going to restore the Republic. And I was like, I don't think so, no. Okay, so that was our final lecture, and thank you all. And of course, I'll take any questions if anybody has any questions. Oh, got questions all over the place.
Well, I just want to say so many thanks, Marianne, for your splendid retelling of wonderful tales and introducing us to gods, goddesses, monsters, heroes. Fabulous. I think some of these beings are still amongst us. And that is, I remember the first time I went to Delphi in Greece, I was so touched by the religiosity of Delphi, the physical setting, that I really thought I might see Apollo stepping around the corner.
Well, the same thing happened to me. I was there, and it was the fall, and I was studying as a graduate student, so there was a whole group of us, and I was sitting on the little porch of the hotel where we were staying, and there was mist everywhere, and I almost thought I was starting to see, yeah.
So next week, Jennifer Rea and Avery Cahill from the Classics Department, Jennifer is the chair, will be sharing an aspect of Norse mythology. And I'm guessing, looking at the title, that they're going to be talking about superheroes in cinema. Am I right? Or
I think that Jennifer specializes in.
And so it'll be a change of venue, but still on the theme of heroes. So questions?
You've inspired me to keep wanting to learn more about Greek and Roman history that I haven't studied for years. I read in the New York Times this morning a review of a book called The Emperors of Rome by someone, I think her name is Mary Beard, who's a historian. So do you know anything about that? Would you recommend it?
Beard's a very distinguished classic scholar. She can also be quite controversial in some of her views, so I'm looking forward to reading that book as well. Yeah, I saw it on display at a convention, but it hadn't come out yet. So yeah, no, that's something I definitely putting on my reading list.
Yeah, and she has a reputation for writing books about the ancient world or Roman world, which are very accessible, but still scholarly. But as Marianne has said, she can be controversial.
Yeah. She has a book on Pompeii that's really, if you're interested in Pompeii, that's really well written.
I just have to say thank you, and I certainly wish you had taught me mythology instead of the instructors I had.
Well, I wish you were my class sometimes instead of some of, not my current classes, but some that I might have had in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, when the father and son were served a meal where the food was on a plate of bread, wasn't that simply a slice of pizza?
Yeah, and in fact, I don't know if you saw, it was in the news I guess over the summer, they found at Pompeii a ancient snack bar, but there are other ancient snack bars there, but this one had a picture of something that really did look like pizza. Now, of course, it can't quite be pizza, our pizza, because the Romans didn't have the thing that we tend to use for pizza. They did not have the tomato. The tomato is not an old world crop. No, you can have so this looked like a pizza. Yeah, so you're right. They had pizza.
Um, I was, I understand there was something about in the Aeneid, going to the underworld, getting the dream for Rome or the instructions for Rome, and this wonderful thing. And it was something about the gate that they left by, or that Aeneas came out
Oh
of.
yeah,
He came out of the gate for false dreams.
Yes, that's one of the problems with what did Virgil really think about Augustus? Did Virgil, because it sounds like Virgil was gung-ho about this destiny of Rome, but you're right, they leave through this gate of false dreams. So what does that?
Well, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
And, you know, it relates exactly to what Mary Ann was saying. What I alluded to at the beginning is that Virgil is very slippery. And that is that, you know, you could read the poem as a great glorification of Rome. But when you look more closely underneath, for example, Book 2 of the Aeneid, the story of the fall of Troy, is so really touching and full of pathos, etc. So I think the gate of the gate of not truths, as it were, really makes you wonder what the message was. Other questions?
But Augustus went with the message that he wanted to go with, and so in fact he built his whole forum where there are statues of Aeneas and Romulus and Remus and all of these Romans from history. They went to the library and came up with all of these non-controversial but great Romans and made a whole passageway of statues that culminates in the statue of Augustus. And that's he liked the Go Augustus interpretation of it.
Thank you so much, Mary Ann, and thank you for being such a good audience.